The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger with each passing minute, and Sarah Mitchell felt her heart pound against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She stood on the wooden porch of her small ranch house, her weathered hands gripping the railing so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, but it wasn't the heat that made sweat bead on her forehead. It was fear. 3 months had passed since her husband Thomas had died in that terrible accident with the cattle. 3 months of struggling to keep the ranch running, of lying awake at night listening to every sound, of wondering if she should pack up and return to her sister's house in Philadelphia. But this land had been Thomas's dream, and somehow it had become hers too. The red dirt, the endless sky, the mountains that changed color with the light, all of it felt like home now, even without him. The riders were closer now, and Sarah could make out their silhouettes against the blazing afternoon sun. Apache warriors, their horses moving with a fluid grace that only came from a lifetime in the saddle. Her neighbors had warned her about this possibility. A woman alone out here, they'd said, shaking their heads. It ain't natural. It ain't safe. But Sarah had stayed. Where else could she go? The lead rider raised his hand, and the group slowed to a stop about 50 yards from her house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she got her first clear look at their leader. He was tall, probably in his 30s, with long black hair that caught the wind. Even from a distance, she could sense a quiet authority in the way he sat his horse, and how the other warriors looked to him before making any move. For a long moment, nobody moved. Sarah felt like she was balanced on the edge of a cliff, one wrong step away from falling into an abyss she couldn't imagine. Her mouth was dry as dust, but she forced herself to speak. "What do you want?" Her voice carried across the desert air, steadier than she'd expected. The leader urged his horse forward, stopping when he was close enough that she could see his face clearly. His features were strong and weathered by sun and wind, but it was his eyes that struck her most. They were dark, almost black, but not cruel. There was intelligence there, and something else, a sadness that reminded her of her own reflection in the mirror these past months. "Water," he said in accented English. "For horses. For my people." Sarah's mind raced. She knew there had been drought in the territory. The Apache had been pushed onto reservations, but those lands were often the worst, dry, barren places where nothing would grow. She also knew that giving aid to Apache warriors could get her in serious trouble with the territorial government. But looking at the man before her, at the way his horse's ribs showed slightly beneath its coat, at the quiet dignity in his posture despite what was clearly a request born of desperation, she found herself nodding. "There's a well behind the house," she said. "Help yourself." Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. He turned to his companions and spoke rapidly in Apache. The words were musical, flowing like water over stones, completely unlike English with its hard consonants and rigid structure. As the warriors moved toward the well, the leader remained where he was, studying Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She was suddenly aware of how she must look, a 32-year-old widow in a faded blue dress, her brown hair escaping from its pins, her face probably streaked with dust and sweat. "You are alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She lifted her chin, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "My husband died. I am sorry." The word seemed genuine, not just politeness. "It is hard to lose someone." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "You've lost someone too." For a moment, his carefully controlled expression cracked, and she saw raw pain flash across his features. "My wife. 2 winters ago. Sickness." The simple words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought of Thomas, of how she'd held his hand as the fever took him despite all her prayers and tears. Suddenly, this Apache warrior didn't seem like a stranger or a threat. He seemed like someone who understood the particular weight of grief, the way it could settle on your shoulders and never quite lift. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He nodded once, then called out to his men. They had finished watering their horses and were preparing to leave. Sarah felt a strange reluctance to see them go. The conversation had been the most human interaction she'd had in weeks. Most of her neighbors kept their distance now, treating her with a mixture of pity and suspicion that made her feel like a ghost haunting her own life. "Wait," she called out as he began to turn his horse. "What's your name?" He paused, looking back at her. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Nahale." "Sarah," she replied. Sarah Mitchell. He repeated her name, the syllables sounding different in his mouth, somehow more musical. Then he was gone, leading his warriors back toward the mountains, leaving only dust and hoof prints as evidence they'd ever been there. That night, Sarah sat on her porch in the darkness, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance. She thought about Nahale's eyes, about the pain she'd recognized there. She thought about his quiet dignity, the respect he'd shown her despite the fact that she was a white woman and he was Apache, traditional enemies, according to everyone she knew. She thought about how long it had been since anyone had looked at her like she was a person rather than a problem to be solved or a burden to be endured. The next morning brought the sound of hoofbeats again, but this time it was her nearest neighbor, Joe Bradley, riding hard toward her house. His face was grim as he dismounted. "Sarah, you gotta be more careful," he said without preamble. "There's Apache been seen in these parts. Could be dangerous." She kept her expression neutral. "Oh, yeah. Some of the boys found tracks near Wilson's place. Fresh ones. You see anything unusual yesterday?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. Then she shook her head. "Nothing." Joe studied her face suspiciously. "Well, you keep that rifle handy, you hear? And if you see any of them red devils, you send word immediately. We'll form up a posse and take care of the problem." After he left, Sarah found herself thinking about his words. Red devils. Problem to be solved. She thought about Nahale asking politely for water, about the exhaustion in his horse's stance, about the grief in his eyes that matched her own. She wondered when exactly she'd stopped seeing the Apache as faceless threats and started seeing them as people. The answer, she realized, was the moment Nahale had said, "I am sorry," and she'd heard genuine understanding in his voice. 3 days later, they came back. This time Sarah was in her garden, trying to coax vegetables from the stubborn desert soil, when she heard the familiar sound of horses approaching. She straightened, her heart racing again, but this time the fear was mixed with something else. Anticipation, maybe. It was a smaller group this time, just Nahale and 2 other warriors. They rode slowly, openly, making no attempt at stealth. Sarah wiped her dirty hands on her apron and walked to meet them. "Water again?" she asked. Nahale shook his head. "We bring gift." He reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. He urged his horse forward and extended it toward her. Sarah took the package carefully, unwrapping it to reveal a beautiful piece of turquoise, carved into the shape of a small bird. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail perfect. She looked up at him in amazement. "It's beautiful." "But why?" "For kindness," he said simply. "Water. No questions." She turned the carving over in her hands, feeling its smooth weight. "I can't accept this. It must have taken hours to make. My grandmother made it. Long ago." His voice was quiet. She said, "Someday it will find person who needs to remember how to fly." The words hit Sarah unexpectedly, bringing tears to her eyes. Since Thomas's death, she felt grounded in the worst way. Trapped, heavy, unable to imagine a future beyond simple survival. The idea of flying seemed impossible. "Thank you," she whispered. Nahale nodded, then seemed to hesitate. "Your garden," he said, gesturing toward the struggling plants behind her. "Desert is hard teacher, but Apache no desert secrets." Without waiting for her response, he dismounted and walked to where she'd been working. He knelt beside her tomato plants, examining the soil with experienced fingers. "Too much water," he said. "Desert plants must learn to be strong. You water little but deep. Make roots search." He showed her how to dig narrow channels that would direct water deep into the soil, how to use rocks to create shade and retain moisture. His hands moved with sure confidence, and Sarah found herself watching not just what he was doing, but how he moved, graceful and economical, no wasted motion. When he finished, he stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "We'll grow better now." "How do you know so much about farming?" Sarah asked. I was told the Apache were nomads." A slight smile crossed his features. "Apache know many things. Hunt, fight, grow food. Survive." The smile faded. "Must survive." There was something in his tone that made Sarah step closer. "Are you in danger?" Nahale glanced toward the mountains, his expression growing distant. "Always in danger. Government wants all Apache on reservation. Bad place. No water, no food. People die there. But If you went, would be death anyway. Slow death. He looked back at her, his dark eyes serious. Something's worse than dying. Sarah felt a chill despite the heat. She'd heard stories about the reservations, but she'd assumed they were exaggerated. Looking at Nahale's face, she realized they probably weren't. How many of you are there? She asked quietly. 43. Women, children, old ones. We try to stay free, but... He shrugged. It's getting harder. Sarah's mind reeled. 43 people, including families, trying to survive in the harsh desert while being hunted by the army. She thought about her own struggles to keep just herself alive on the ranch, and couldn't imagine the responsibility Nahale must feel. Where are they now? She asked. Nahale studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust her with the information. Finally, he pointed toward a distant ridge. Hidden Canyon. 2 hours ride. And you're their leader? They chose me. He said it matter-of-factly, without pride or complaint. After the soldiers killed my father. The casual way he mentioned his father's death made Sarah's breath catch. She was beginning to understand that Nahale's losses went far beyond just his wife. His entire world had been taken from him, piece by piece. I'm sorry, she said again, and again she meant it completely. Nahale shrugged. His past. Must think of now, of future. He glanced toward the sun, which was beginning to sink toward the western horizon. Must go. People worry if I'm gone too long. As he moved toward his horse, Sarah found herself speaking without thinking. Come back. He paused, looking back at her. Why? It was a fair question, and Sarah wasn't sure she had a good answer. I don't know. It's been nice. Having someone to talk to. Something shifted in Nahale's expression. You were lonely. It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. Very. I understand lonely, he said quietly. For a moment they looked at each other across the dusty yard, two people who had lost everything important to them, each isolated in their own way. Then Nahale mounted his horse. I will come back, he said. If you want. I want, Sarah replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. After they left, Sarah sat on her porch holding the turquoise bird, watching the sun set over the mountains. For the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel completely alone. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. Nahale was Apache, she was white, and their two peoples were at war. Nothing good could come of the connection she felt forming between them. But as she traced the smooth curves of the carved bird with her finger, Sarah found she didn't care about danger. She'd been existing rather than living for too long. Maybe it was time to remember how to fly. The turquoise bird seemed to warm in her palm, as if responding to her thoughts. Tomorrow, she decided, she would work on her garden using Nahale's methods. She would water deep and let the roots grow strong. And maybe, just maybe, she would start to grow strong too. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm that Sarah had never expected. Every few days, Nahale would appear, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two of his warriors. At first, the visits were practical. They needed water, or to trade for supplies, or to ask about army patrols in the area. But gradually, something deeper developed. Sarah found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. Nahale had a way of seeing things that was completely different from anyone she'd ever known. Where she saw a harsh desert, he saw a complex ecosystem full of life and possibility. Where she saw obstacles, he saw opportunities to learn and grow stronger. Your tomatoes are growing well, he observed on one visit, kneeling to examine the plants that were indeed thriving under his guidance. Thanks to you, Sarah replied, settling beside him in the dirt. Over the past weeks, she'd grown comfortable with his presence in a way that surprised her. There was something peaceful about Nahale, despite the obvious strength and capability that radiated from him. Not because of me, because you listened. Big difference. Sarah smiled at that. It was typical of him to deflect credit while still making a point. You're a good teacher. My grandmother was a good teacher. I just remember her words. Nahale's expression grew distant. She used to say that the desert teaches in whispers. Most people too busy shouting to hear. What else did she teach you? Nahale was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently sifting through the soil. When he spoke, his voice was soft with memory. Many things. How to read the sky for weather, how to find water in places that look empty, how to make plants grow in impossible places. He paused. How to see the spirit in all living things, even in white people. Sarah asked the question lightly, but she was genuinely curious. Nahale looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious, especially in people who asked that question. There was something in his tone that made Sarah's heart skip. Over their conversations, she'd begun to suspect that Nahale saw her differently than she'd expected. Not as an enemy or even just an ally of convenience, but as, what exactly? Tell me about your people, she said, partly changed the subject, and partly because she was genuinely interested. The ones in the canyon. Nahale's expression grew complex. They are afraid, tired. Some want to surrender, go to reservation. They think maybe it will be better than running. What do you think? I think reservation is death. Maybe slow, but still death. His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. My people need to be free. Like eagle, like wolf. Cage them, and their spirit dies. Sarah thought about her own life before Thomas's death. Comfortable, but constrained by social expectations. Always doing what was proper rather than what felt right. In some ways, she understood what Nahale meant about cages. But you can't run forever, she said gently. The army has more men, more supplies. Eventually, yes. But not today. Today we are still free. Nahale looked toward the mountains where his people were hidden. Every day of freedom is worth the risk. The certainty in his voice made Sarah feel ashamed of her own fears. Here was a man who had lost everything, but still fought for what mattered to him. Meanwhile, she'd been hiding on her ranch, afraid to even try to truly live again. You think I'm a coward, she said quietly. Nahale turned to her in surprise. Why would I think that? I just survive. I don't really live. Not like you do. You think choosing to stay here alone is not brave? Nahale shook his head. You think caring for this land by yourself, making things grow, refusing to give up, you think this is cowardice? Sarah hadn't thought about it that way. It's just what I had to do. Same as me. Same as my people. We all do what we must do to survive. But he studied her face carefully. You do more than survive. You grow things. You help strangers. You keep hope alive. This is not a small thing. The unexpected praise made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. When was the last time someone had seen her as more than just a problem or a burden? When had anyone looked at her and seen strength instead of weakness? Thank you, she whispered. It's truth. Nahale's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes were warm. You remind me that not all white people are the same. Some have good hearts. The compliment sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest, but it also brought a stab of guilt. My neighbors wouldn't agree. If they knew I was helping you, you were afraid of them? Sarah considered the question honestly. Yes, they can make trouble for me. Take my land, drive me away. Then, why do you help? It was a question Sarah had been asking herself. The easy answer was that it was the Christian thing to do. Help those in need regardless of who they were. But if she was being honest, it went deeper than that. Because when I look at you, I don't see an enemy. I see. She struggled for words. I see someone who understands loss. Someone who knows what it means to keep going when everything you loved is gone. Nahale was very still, watching her face intently. And I see someone who makes me remember what it feels like to be alive. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to face. But they were true. Nahale's visits had become the brightest part of her days, the thing she looked forward to most. His presence made her feel like herself again. Not the grieving widow everyone saw, but the woman she'd been before loss had dimmed all the colors in her world. Sarah, Nahale's voice was very soft. This is dangerous feeling. I know. She met his eyes steadily. I know it's dangerous. For both of us. My people would not understand. Your people would not understand. I know that too. They sat in silence for a while, both aware they were approaching the edge of something that would change everything. Sarah could feel her heart pounding, could see the conflict in Nahale's expression. He was a leader responsible for the survival of his people. She was a white woman in territory where the wrong association could mean death. The smart thing would be to step back, to keep their relationship simple and practical. Instead, Sarah found herself saying, "Show me your canyon." Nahale's eyes widened. "Sarah, I want to see how your people live. I want to understand. Too dangerous. If you are seen, then we'll make sure I'm not seen." Sarah surprised herself with her determination. "You've shown me so much about the desert, about growing things, about surviving. I want to see more." Nahale studied her for a long moment. Sarah could see him weighing the risks, considering the implications. Finally, he shook his head. "Cannot bring white woman to our hiding place. Too much danger for everyone. Sarah felt a stab of disappointment, but she understood. You're right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. But Nahale continued, and Sarah's heart jumped. There's place between your land and ours. Sacred place for Apache. I could show you there. When? Tomorrow. Dawn. Come alone. Tell no one. His expression was serious. If anyone sees us together, I understand. Sarah's pulse was racing with excitement and fear. I'll be careful. That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she was getting herself into. Meeting Nahale near her house was one thing. She could always claim he'd threatened her, that she'd had no choice. But deliberately seeking him out, traveling to meet him, there was no innocent explanation for that. But as she thought about the loneliness that had consumed her since Thomas's death, about the slow deadening of her spirit that had been happening day by day, Sarah knew she had to take the risk. Nahale made her feel alive in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. Whatever happened, it had to be better than the gray emptiness that had become her life. She rose before dawn, dressing in her oldest clothes and taking only water and a little food. As she saddled her horse, her hands shook slightly with nerves. She told herself a dozen times that she could still change her mind, still stay safe behind the walls she'd built around her heart. But when she saw Nahale waiting at the designated meeting place, a distinctive red rock formation about an hour's ride from a ranch, Sarah knew there was no going back. You came, he said, and she could hear surprise in his voice. Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you would. I also hoped you would not. His smile was rueful. Contradiction. They rode together through the desert landscape as the sun climbed higher, Nahale leading them along paths that were invisible to Sarah's eyes, but obviously familiar to him. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this harsh environment. Where are we going exactly? Sarah asked after they'd been riding for nearly an hour. Place of power, where Apache have come for generations to speak with spirits, to find guidance. Nahale glanced at her. His sacred place. I would not bring just anyone there. The weight of that trust settled on Sarah's shoulders. Thank you. They rode in comfortable silence after that, Sarah's nervousness gradually giving way to wonder. Seeing the desert through Nahale's eyes was like discovering a completely different world. He pointed out signs of life that she would never have noticed, the tiny flowers hiding in the shadow of rocks, the subtle tracks that told stories of the animals who moved through this landscape, the way the light changed the character of the land from moment to moment. When they finally stopped, Sarah gasped. They stood at the edge of a hidden valley, a green oasis tucked between towering red cliffs. A spring fed a small stream that meandered through the valley floor, creating a strip of lush growth in the midst of the desert. It's beautiful, she breathed. Apache call it place where water speaks, Nahale said. Gulme, I will show you. They left their horses at the valley's edge and descended on foot. The temperature dropped noticeably as they approached the water, and Sarah could hear what Nahale meant about the water speaking. The spring bubbled up from underground with a musical quality that was almost like conversation. My people have come here for generations, Nahale explained as they settled beside the stream. For ceremonies, for healing, for guidance when the path is not clear. And you brought me here because... Nahale was quiet for a long moment, staring into the clear water. Because my path is not clear. Because I need guidance. Sarah waited, sensing that he was struggling with something important. My people trust me to lead them, he finally said, to make choices that keep them alive. But I am torn. Between what? Between duty and... He looked at her directly. And feelings that are dangerous. Sarah's heart stopped. The careful dance they'd been doing around their growing connection was about to end. She could feel in the air between them, electric and inevitable. Nahale, I think about you, he said quietly. When I should be thinking about my people's safety, when I should be planning our next move, when I should be sleeping. You are my thoughts. The raw honesty in his voice made Sarah's breath catch. I think about you too, more than I should. This is wrong, Nahale said, but there was no conviction in his voice. We are from different worlds, different peoples. Are we? Sarah moved closer to him, close enough to see the pain and longing in his dark eyes. Or are we just two people who found something in each other that we thought we'd lost forever? Nahale reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and touched her face with gentle fingers. You are not afraid? I'm terrified, Sarah admitted. But not of you. of what this means, of what could happen to both of us. Should stop now, Nahale whispered, but he didn't pull his hand away. Should, Sarah agreed, but she didn't move either. For a moment, they stayed like that, balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Then, Nahale leaned forward and kissed her soft and sweet and full of all the longing they'd been trying to deny. When they broke apart, Sarah felt like the world had shifted around her. Everything looked different, more vivid, more real. The sacred spring bubbled its ancient song. The sun painted the canyon walls with impossible colors, and Nahale's eyes held a warmth that made her feel like she could face anything. This changes everything, she whispered. Yes, Nahale agreed. Changes everything. They spent the rest of the morning in the hidden valley, talking and learning about each other in ways that went far beyond their previous careful conversations. Nahale told her about his childhood, about the Apache way of seeing the world as connected and alive. Sarah shared memories of her life before Thomas's death, dreams she'd almost forgotten she'd once had. But eventually reality intruded. They had to return before their absence was noticed, had to figure out what this new connection between them meant for their impossible situation. What happens now? Sarah asked as they prepared to leave. I do not know, Nahale admitted. But I know I cannot pretend this did not happen. Neither can I. As they rode back towards Sarah's ranch, both lost in their own thoughts, neither saw the figure watching them from a distant ridge. Joe Bradley lowered his spyglass with a grim expression, his mind already racing with the implications of what he'd witnessed. The widow Mitchell was consorting with Apache. The thought made his blood boil. He'd suspected something when she'd seemed so unconcerned about the Indian raids, but he'd never imagined this. By evening, Joe Bradley had made his decision. The territorial authorities needed to know about this betrayal. Sarah Mitchell was a threat to every decent white person in the territory, and she needed to be stopped before her treasonous behavior got someone killed. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to her ranch with her heart full of joy and terror in equal measure. She touched her lips, still feeling the warmth of Nahale's kiss, still tasting the promise and impossibility of what they'd begun. She was in love with an Apache warrior. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, it made her feel more alive than she had since Thomas's death. But love, Sarah was beginning to realize, was the most dangerous emotion of all in a world where the wrong feelings could mean death for everyone involved. The knock on Sarah's door came at dawn, sharp and demanding. She'd been awake for hours, unable to sleep after the magical day she'd spent with Nahale in the hidden valley. Her lips still tingled with the memory of his kiss, and her heart raced every time she thought about the way he'd looked at her, like she was something precious and wonderful. But the aggressive pounding on her door brought her crashing back to reality. Through the window, she could see Joe Bradley on her porch, but he wasn't alone. 3 other men stood behind him, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of men who'd come on serious business. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Had someone seen her with Nahale? She forced herself to appear calm as she opened the door, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Joe, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. What brings you here so early? We need to talk, Sarah. Joe's voice was hard, his eyes cold. About your Apache friends. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she fought to keep her expression neutral. I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to us. This came from Tom Wilson, one of the other men. His hand rested meaningfully on his gun. Joe saw you yesterday, riding with one of them. Sarah's mind raced. If Joe had seen her with Nahale, there was no point in denying it completely. But maybe she could control the narrative, make it seem like something other than what it was. An Apache warrior came here asking for water, she said carefully. I gave it to him. Then he offered to show me some medicinal plants in exchange. I thought it might be useful knowledge. Medicinal plants, Joe said skeptically. That's what you call it. That's what it was. Sarah lifted her chin, trying to project more confidence than she felt. I'm alone out here, Joe. I have to get along with my neighbors, even if they're Apache. Your neighbors? Tom Wilson's voice was incredulous. Sarah, those people are savages. They're murdering, stealing. The one I met was neither murdering nor stealing, Sarah interrupted. He was polite, respectful. He needed water, and I gave it to him. And that's all. Joe's eyes were sharp, studying her face for signs of deception. That's all. The lie felt bitter on Sarah's tongue, but what choice did she have? The men exchanged glances, clearly not entirely convinced. Finally, Joe spoke again. Sarah, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt here, because I knew your husband and he was a good man. But I'm warning you, any further contact with hostile Indians, and we'll have to involve the territorial authorities. You understand what that means. Sarah understood perfectly. It meant arrest, trial, possibly execution for treason. It meant the end of everything. I understand, she said quietly. Good. Joe touched the brim of his hat. We'll be keeping a closer eye on this area from now on. For your protection, of course. After they left, Sarah sank into a chair, her hands shaking with reaction. They suspected, but they didn't know for certain. She was safe for now, but any future meetings with Nahale would be incredibly dangerous. The thought of never seeing him again made her chest tight with panic. In just a few short weeks, he'd become essential to her happiness, to her sense of herself as a living woman rather than a walking ghost. But what choice did she have? 2 days later, Nahale appeared at her usual gardening time, as if nothing had happened. Sarah's heart leaped at the sight of him, but terror followed immediately after. You can't be here, she said urgently, not even greeting him properly. Joe Bradley saw us. He came with others. They're watching. Nahale's expression darkened. They threatened you? They warned me. No more contact with hostile Indians, or they'll turn me over to the authorities. Sarah's voice was tight with fear. Nahale, if they catch us together again, they will not catch us. His voice was quiet but certain. There are ways. No. Sarah shook her head firmly. It's too dangerous. For both of us. Your people need you alive, and her voice broke. I can't be the reason you get killed. Nahale dismounted and moved toward her, ignoring her protests. Sarah, look at me. Reluctantly, she met his eyes. The warmth there made her want to cry. Do you want me to stay away? He asked quietly. The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah knew what the smart answer was, what the safe answer was. But as she looked into Nahale's face, at the man who had brought light back into her dark world, she found she couldn't say it. No, she whispered. I don't want you to stay away. Then, we find another way. Nahale reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small piece of white cloth. If you need to see me, if there is trouble, put this on your porch rail. I will watch for it. Sarah took the cloth, her fingers brushing his. Even that small contact sent warmth shooting through her. How will you watch without being seen? A slight smile crossed Nahale's features. Apache know how to watch without being seen. Is what we do. Despite her fear, Sarah found herself smiling back. And if you need to see me? There. Nahale pointed to a distinctive rock formation visible from Sarah's porch. If there are 3 small stones balanced on top of each other, meet me at sunset at the place where water speaks. The coded communication system felt both romantic and terrifying. They were really doing this, carrying on a secret relationship that could get them both killed. This is crazy, Sarah murmured. Yes, Nahale agreed. Very crazy. But he leaned down and kissed her anyway, soft and sweet and full of promise. When he pulled back, his dark eyes were serious. Sarah, what we have is not just feeling, is choice. Every day, choice to risk everything for something that matters more than safety. I know. Sarah's voice was steady now, her decision made. I'm choosing you, whatever the risk. After Nahale left, Sarah stood on her porch holding the white cloth signal, thinking about choices and risks and the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, she'd been a conventional widow, grieving quietly and trying to figure out how to survive alone. Now she was in love with an Apache warrior, planning secret meetings and defying everything her society expected of her. The transformation should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel more like herself than she had in years. That evening, Sarah was startled by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Captain James Morrison of the Territorial Army rode up to her house with a small escort, his blue uniform crisp despite the desert heat. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, touching his hat politely as he dismounted. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Of course not, Captain. Sarah forced a smile, though her heart was racing. What can I do for you? I understand you've had some encounters with Apache raiders in this area. Sarah's mouth went dry. Encounters? Your neighbor, Mr. Bradley, reported that you've had contact with hostile Indians. I wanted to hear your account firsthand. Sarah's mind raced. How much had Joe told the captain? How much did he suspect? A warrior came asking for water, she said carefully. I gave it to him. That's all. Captain Morrison studied her face intently. And you weren't frightened? A woman alone, faced with a hostile Apache. He didn't seem hostile. He was polite, respectful. Mrs. Mitchell, with respect, you may be underestimating the danger. These Apache are extremely cunning. They're known to use friendly approaches as a way to gather intelligence, to identify easy targets. The implication was clear. He thought she'd been duped by a clever enemy scout. If only he knew the truth. I appreciate your concern, Captain, Sarah said. But I was careful. I'm sure you were. However, I have to ask. Did this Apache ask you any questions? About army patrols, about your neighbors, about local defenses? No, Sarari honestly. He asked for water. That's all. Captain Morrison nodded, but his expression remained serious. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to be frank with you. We believe there's a band of Apache hiding somewhere in this area. We've had reports of cattle theft, missing supplies, possible reconnaissance activities. We're planning a sweep operation to locate and neutralize this threat. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. They were planning to hunt Nahale and his people. When? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Soon, within the next week or two. In the meantime, I'm posting extra patrols in this area. For your protection, of course, but also to gather intelligence on Apache movements. After the captain left, Sarah paced her small house like a caged animal. She had to warn Nahale, but how? She couldn't put up the white cloth signal. There were soldiers watching now. Any unusual activity would be noticed. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with possibilities. Finally, just before dawn, she made a decision. She would have to take an enormous risk, but she couldn't let Nahale and his people walk into a trap. She rose early and saddled her horse, telling herself she was going to check on some cattle in the far pasture. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did have cattle in that direction, and checking on them gave her a reasonable excuse to ride toward the mountains. She was careful to take a roundabout route, one that would look natural to any watchers but would eventually bring her near the area where she thought Nahale's people might be hiding. She had no real plan beyond getting close enough to somehow signal a warning. As she rode, Sarah thought about the captain's words. A sweep operation to neutralize the threat. She wondered if Captain Morrison saw Nahale's people as human beings at all, or just as problems to be solved with bullets. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the movement in the rocks above her. But Apache training and stealth, she was learning, was no match for Apache watchfulness. Within moments, she was surrounded by 3 warriors on horseback, their faces grim and suspicious. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought they might not recognize her. Then, one of them, a young man she'd seen with Nahale several times, spoke in accented English. White woman, why are you here? I need to see Nahale, Sarah said urgently. It's important. Don't you? The warriors exchanged rapid conversation in Apache. Sarah caught a few words that Nahale had taught her, soldiers and trap, but she couldn't follow the full discussion. Finally, the young warrior who'd spoken before nodded. Kulme. But if this is trick, it's not a trick, Sarah said firmly. I swear it's not a trick. They rode deeper into the mountains than Sarah had ever been, following paths that seemed invisible but were obviously well known to her guides. Finally, they emerged into a hidden canyon that took Sarah's breath away. It was larger than she'd expected, with a good water source and natural shelters formed by overhanging rock. But what struck her most were the people, families, children, elderly men, and women, all the non-combatants that Sarah had somehow not really thought about when she pictured Nahale's band of Apache warriors. These weren't savage raiders. They were families trying to survive, children playing games in the dust, grandmothers mending clothes, men crafting weapons not for aggression, but for protection. They looked up as Sarah rode into their sanctuary, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and alarm at seeing a white woman in their midst. Nahale emerged from one of the shelters, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he saw Sarah's face. What is wrong? He asked immediately. Soldiers, Sarah said breathlessly. Captain Morrison came to my house. They're planning a sweep operation. They know you're in this area. The words caused an immediate stir throughout the camp. Women began gathering children, men reached for weapons, and Sarah could feel the fear that rippled through the group like a physical thing. Nahale spoke rapidly in Apache, clearly giving orders. Then, he turned back to Sarah. When? Soon. Within the next week or two. But, Nahale, they're posting extra patrols. The area is going to be crawling with soldiers. Nahale's jaw tightened. We will have to move. Again. Where will you go? Deeper into mountains. Harder country, but safer. He looked around at his people. and Sarah could see the weight of responsibility in his expression. Will be difficult for children, for old ones. Sarah's heart broke looking at the camp. She could see the exhaustion in people's faces, the way the constant running was wearing them down. How long could they keep this up? There has to be another way, she said desperately. What other way? Nahale's voice was bitter. Surrender? Go to reservation? You have seen how government keeps promises to Apache. Sarah had no answer to that. She'd heard the stories about conditions on the reservations, about the corruption and neglect that made them little better than prisons. I should go, she said reluctantly. If I'm gone too long, they'll get suspicious. Nahale nodded, but his hand caught hers. Sarah, you took great risk to warn us. Why? She looked into his dark eyes, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with, the leader who carried the survival of his people on his shoulders, the warrior who'd shown her how to live again. Because I love you, she said simply. And I love these people too, because they're your people. Something shifted in Nahale's expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. You say you love my people. Yes. Even though they are Apache? Even though your people call them savage. Sarah looked around the camp again, seeing the obvious care the family showed for each other, the respect the young showed for their elders, the way everyone worked together for the common good. Your people aren't savage, she said firmly. They're just trying to survive with dignity. There's nothing savage about that. Nahale studied her face for a long moment. Then he called out something in Apache. An elderly woman approached, tiny and weathered, but with eyes that seemed to see everything. My grandmother, Nahale explained. She wants to meet the white woman who risks her life to warn us. The old woman spoke to Nahale in rapid Apache, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Whatever she said made Nahale's eyebrows rise in surprise. What did she say? Sarah asked. She says, Nahale hesitated. She says the spirits have been telling her about a woman with a good heart who would help our people. She says she dreamed about you before we ever met. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. That's impossible. The grandmother spoke again, this time reaching out to touch Sarah's hand. Her fingers were warm and strong despite her apparent age. She says the spirits do not lie, Nahale translated. She says you have a Apache heart in white woman's body. She says, he paused, clearly struggling with the translation. She says the Great Spirit has a plan, and you are part of it. Before Sarah could respond to that startling statement, one of the sentries called out a warning. Riders were approaching the valley. Immediately, the camp sprang into action. Children were gathered, weapons readied, escape routes prepared. But as the riders came into view, Sarah could see blue uniforms, and her heart sank. Soldiers, she breathed. Nahale's hand went to his rifle. They followed you. No. Sarah's voice was desperate. I was careful. I swear I was careful. But the evidence was undeniable. A patrol of cavalry was approaching the canyon, and they were clearly searching for something. Go, Nahale said urgently. Take the back trail. If they find you here, I'm not leaving you. Sarah, Nahale's voice was sharp with command. Go, now. But it was too late. The soldiers had reached the canyon mouth, and Captain Morrison's voice rang out across the space. This is the United States Army. Come out with your hands visible, and you will not be harmed. Sarah knew it was a lie. Apache weren't taken prisoner. They were shot on sight. Her heart raced as she realized the magnitude of the disaster. Because of her, because she tried to help, Nahale's people were about to be massacred. This is my fault, she whispered. No, Nahale said firmly. This is not your fault. This is what was always going to happen. He looked at his people, his responsibility, his family, his world, and Sarah could see him making the hardest calculation any leader could make. Surrender? She asked hopefully. Nahale shook his head. Fight, and hope some escape. As the Apache warriors took up defensive positions and Captain Morrison's soldiers prepared to attack, Sarah realized that everything was about to change. The storm that had been gathering since the day she'd first given water to an Apache warrior was finally about to break. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The gunfire erupted like thunder in the confined space of the canyon, echoing off the rock walls and seeming to come from everywhere at once. Sarah crouched behind a boulder, her heart hammering as bullets whined overhead, and Apache war cries mixed with the shouts of soldiers. This wasn't how she'd imagined war. In her mind, battles were organized things, lines of men facing each other across open fields, like the engravings she'd seen of the Civil War. This was chaos, smoke and dust, and the horrible sounds of people dying, and she was trapped in the middle of it. Nahale was somewhere ahead of her, directing his warriors' defense with calm authority despite the deadly situation. Sarah had lost sight of him when the shooting started, and the not knowing was almost worse than the bullets flying around her. A soldier appeared suddenly, at the mouth of the small cave where Sarah was hiding, his rifle raised. For a split second, their eyes met, and she saw his shocked recognition. A white woman in an Apache stronghold during a battle. She could read the questions and accusations in his expression. Before either of them could speak, an Apache arrow took the soldier in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell heavily, his rifle clattering away across the rocks. Sarah found herself moving without thinking, crawling toward the wounded man. "Don't," she said urgently as he reached for his sidearm. "You're badly hurt. Let me help." The soldier, barely more than a boy, really, stared at her in confusion. "Ma'am, why are you here?" Sarah pressed her shawl against his bleeding shoulder, trying to stop the flow of blood. "That doesn't matter now. Hold this tight." "But you're—" The young soldier's voice was weak with shock and blood loss. "You're with them. With the Apache." "I'm helping a wounded person," Sarah said firmly. "That's all that matters." Around them, the battle raged on. Sarah could hear Captain Morrison's voice shouting orders, the crack of rifles, the thud of arrows hitting wood and stone. But in the small space where she crouched with the wounded soldier, time seemed suspended. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to keep the boy conscious. Private Jenkins, ma'am." "Billy Jenkins." "Well, Billy Jenkins, you're going to be fine if you stay awake and keep pressure on this wound." Billy's eyes were growing unfocused. "My ma, she's going to be so worried when she hears." "Your ma is going to see you again," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "I promise." A shadow fell across them, and Sarah looked up to see one of Nahale's warriors standing over them, his rifle pointed at Billy's head. The Apache's face was grim, his eyes hard with the kind of anger that came from watching his people being hunted like animals. "No," Sarah said quickly, putting herself between the warrior and the wounded soldier. "He's just a boy. He's badly hurt." The warrior spoke rapid Apache, clearly arguing with her even though she couldn't understand the words. But his meaning was clear enough. This was war, and wounded enemies were still enemies. "Please," Sarah said, looking directly into the warrior's eyes. "Please don't." For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then, with obvious reluctance, the Apache warrior lowered his rifle and moved away to rejoin the fight. Billy had witnessed the entire exchange with wide, frightened eyes. You saved my life." "I try to save a life," Sarah corrected. "That's what decent people do." The fighting seemed to be intensifying. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of Nahale's rifle from somewhere above them, and she sent up a desperate prayer for his safety. The canyon was a natural fortress, but the soldiers had numbers and superior firepower. How long could the Apache hold out? Her question was answered when she heard Captain Morrison's voice booming across the canyon. "Apache, you are surrounded. Surrender now, and the women and children will be spared." The shooting stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crying of children. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see what would happen. Nahale's voice answered from the rocks above. "What guarantee do we have? My word as an officer and a gentleman." Even from her hiding place, Sarah could hear the bitter laugh that followed that statement. Nahale had seen too much of military promises to put much faith in them. "Your word," Nahale called back. Like the word given to Mangas Coloradus before he was murdered under flag of truce. Like the word given to my father before he was shot down while surrendering. The silence stretched out, heavy with the weight of history and betrayal. Finally, Captain Morrison spoke again, and this time his voice was colder. "Those were different circumstances. I'm offering you terms." "What terms?" "Unconditional surrender. You will all be taken to the reservation, where you will be provided with food and shelter." Another bitter laugh from the rocks. "And how long before we starve on your reservation? How long before our children die of diseases that do not exist in the clean mountains?" Sarah listened to the exchange with growing despair. There was no trust between these two peoples, and without trust, there could be no peace. Only more death. "I'm losing patience," Captain Morrison called out. "Surrender now, or face the consequences." The consequences of fighting for our freedom. Nahale's voice carried clearly in the still air. We accept those consequences. Billy Jenkins gripped Sarah's hand weakly. Ma'am, they're going to fight to the death. All of them, even the women and children. Sarah knew he was right. She'd seen the determination in the faces of Nahale's people. They would rather die free than live as prisoners. Unless, she murmured, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Unless what, ma'am? Sarah was thinking furiously. What if there was another option? What if someone could speak for the Apache, someone the soldiers would listen to? Before she could lose her nerve, Sarah stood up. Captain Morrison, she called out, her voice echoing across the canyon. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, who is that? Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. I'm coming out. Sarah, no. Nahale's voice was sharp with alarm. But Sarah was already moving, her hands raised, walking slowly toward the canyon mouth where Captain Morrison waited with his men. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, soldiers staring in shock, Apache watching in confusion and concern. When she reached the soldier's position, Captain Morrison's face was a study in barely controlled fury. Mrs. Mitchell, would you care to explain what you're doing in an Apache stronghold during a military operation? I came to try to prevent a massacre, Sarah said, meeting his eyes steadily. A massacre? The captain's voice was dangerously quiet. Mrs. Mitchell, we are conducting a lawful military operation against hostile Apache raiders. Those people aren't raiders, Captain. They're families, children, old people. They're trying to survive. They're enemies of the United States, and you... Captain Morrison's voice rose. You are apparently a traitor. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stand straighter. I'm an American citizen trying to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. By consorting with the enemy? By giving aid and comfort to Apache raiders? Captain Morrison gestured toward the canyon. Do you have any idea what the penalty is for treason, Mrs. Mitchell? Sarah knew exactly what the penalty was. Death. But, looking back toward the rocks where Nahale's people were hiding, knowing that children were cowering in fear while their parents prepared to die rather than surrender, she found she didn't care about her own safety. Captain, what if I could guarantee their peaceful surrender? What if I could convince them to come with you willingly? Morrison's eyes narrowed. What are you proposing? Safe passage to the reservation. Real safety, not just promises. And Sarah took a deep breath. And I go with them. Absolutely not. Why not? I'm obviously compromised as far as my loyalty is concerned. You can't trust me to live freely among white settlers. But if I'm on the reservation, you can keep an eye on me. Captain Morrison studied her face for a long moment. And you think your presence would make the Apache more likely to surrender? I think it might. It was a desperate gamble, and Sarah knew it. She was betting everything on the idea that Nahale would surrender to save his people, and that her willingness to share their fate might convince him that the Army's promises were genuine. Sarah, Nahale's voice called from the rocks. What are you doing? Sarah turned toward his position, though she couldn't see him clearly. I'm trying to save your people, Nahale, and mine too. Captain Morrison looked between Sarah and the hidden Apache with calculation in his eyes. Finally, he spoke. Apache leader, I'm prepared to offer modified terms. I'll listen, came Nahale's cautious reply. Safe transport to the reservation for all your people. No reprisals, no punishment for your resistance. Food and supplies for the journey. Medical care for your wounded. And in exchange, complete surrender. You turn over all weapons and come peacefully. Sarah held her breath, waiting for Nahale's response. The silence stretched out until she thought her nerves might snap. What guarantee? Nahale finally called. Captain Morrison looked at Sarah, and she could see the calculation in his expression. He was a practical man, and ending this standoff without further casualties would look much better in his report than a bloody massacre. Mrs. Mitchell has volunteered to accompany you to the reservation, he said, as a gesture of good faith. More silence. Sarah could almost feel Nahale's internal struggle, the desire to protect his people warring with his distrust of military promises. I must speak with my counsel, Nahale said finally. You have 10 minutes, Morrison replied. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. She stood between the two groups, belonging fully to neither, while conversations took place in whispered Apache and muttered English around her. Finally, Nahale appeared at the edge of the rocks, his hands visible and empty. Slowly, he walked down into the open area of the canyon, stopping about 20 feet from where Sarah and Captain Morrison waited. Up close, Sarah could see the toll the crisis had taken on him. His face was drawn with exhaustion and worry, and there was a cut on his forehead that had bled down the side of his face. But his bearing was still proud, still dignified. "I agree to your terms," he said quietly, "but with conditions." "You're not in a position to make conditions," Captain Morrison said sharply. "I am in a position to choose how my people die," Nahale replied calmly. "If you want surrender instead of battle, you will hear my conditions." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Speak." "The women and children travel in your wagons, not on foot. The wounded are treated by your doctor." And Nahale's eyes found Sarah's. "Mrs. Mitchell travels with us by her choice, not as your prisoner." "Agreed," Morrison said after a moment's consideration. Nahale nodded once, then turned and called out to his people in Apache. Slowly, figures began emerging from the rocks. First the warriors, their weapons held high in surrender, then the women and children and elderly. Sarah's heart broke as she watched them. These proud people forced to give up their freedom, their homeland, their way of life. All because two peoples couldn't find a way to share the same land in peace. As the Apache gathered in the center of the canyon, Sarah found herself standing next to Nahale. Neither of them spoke, but their hands brushed together briefly, a moment of contact that had to last them through whatever came next. "You did not have to do this," Nahale said quietly. "Yes, I did," Sarah replied. "This isn't wrong, Nahale. Whatever anyone says, what we have isn't wrong. I belong with you." Captain Morrison was organizing his men, preparing for the long journey to the reservation. Soon they would all be moving, leaving this hidden canyon forever. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Nahale looked around at the place that had been his people's sanctuary, then at the uncertain future that awaited them all. "Now we survive," he said simply. Together, as the sun began to set over the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of red and gold, Sarah realized that her life, as she had known it, was over. But, looking at the man beside her, at the people who had become her people, she felt no regret. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. Together, the reservation was worse than Sarah had imagined, and she tried to prepare herself for the worst. After 3 days of travel in army wagons, watching Nahale's people, her people now, grown more silent and withdrawn with each mile that took them further from their ancestral lands, they arrived at a place that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. The San Carlos Reservation stretched across a valley of red dirt and sparse grass, dotted with ramshackle buildings and army tents. There was water, but it tasted of alkali and had to be rationed. There were government-issued supplies, but never enough and always of the poorest quality. There were rules, endless, petty rules about where people could go, what they could do when they could gather together. Sarah's arrival caused a sensation among both the Apache residents and the white administrators. A white woman voluntarily living among the Apache was unprecedented, and nobody quite knew what to do with her. Agent Samuel Crawford, the government representative in charge of the reservation, was a thin, nervous man who seemed to view every Apache as a potential threat and every problem as someone else's responsibility. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said when Sarah reported to his office on their first morning, "I have to say, your presence here is highly irregular." "I'm sure it is, Mr. Crawford," Sarah replied calmly, "but here I am nonetheless." "Yes, well," Crawford shuffled through papers on his desk. "I've received orders from a territorial government regarding your status. You're to be considered a ward of the state under protective custody." "Protective custody?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Am I a prisoner?" "Not exactly, but you'll need permission to leave the reservation, and your movements will be monitored." Sarah nodded, having expected something like this. "I understand. Where will I be living?" Crawford looked even more uncomfortable. "That's the problem. You can't live with the Apache families. It's against regulations. But we don't have facilities for white women either." "Then, I suppose you'll have to bend the regulations," Sarah said pleasantly. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Mr. Crawford." Sarah's voice took on a steely quality. "I gave up my home, my security, and my place in white society to come here. I'm not going to be separated from the people I came to help. You'll find me suitable accommodation with Nahale's band, or I'll make your life very difficult." The threat was politely spoken, but unmistakable. Crawford, clearly recognizing that his superiors would blame him for any complication Sarah caused, eventually agreed to allow her to live in a small cabin near the Apache encampment. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, no real furniture, gaps in the walls that let in wind and dust, but it was hers. More importantly, it was close enough to Nahale's people that she could be part of their daily life. The first months were the hardest. Sarah had never lived in poverty, never gone hungry, never had to worry about basic necessities like clean water and warm clothing. The Apache families took her in with a mixture of curiosity, gratitude, and gentle amusement at her inability to perform basic tasks they'd mastered as children. Nahale's grandmother, who had insisted Sarah call her Nana, became her unofficial teacher in the ways of Apache life. The old woman spoke almost no English, but she had an infinite patience for teaching Sarah how to cook over an open fire, how to mend clothes without a sewing machine, how to make a little food stretch a long way. She says you learn quick for someone so old. Nahale translated after one particularly intense cooking lesson that had left Sarah exhausted and covered in smoke. "Oh," Sarah protested. "I'm 32. Nahale's eyes twinkled. "Apache women usually learn these things as children." "Well, this Apache woman is learning them now," Sarah replied, and was rewarded with one of Nahale's rare smiles. The relationship between Sarah and Nahale had to be carefully managed on the reservation. Officially, they were just 2 residents who happened to live near each other. Unofficially, everyone knew there was something between them, but the Apache families were discreet, and the white administrators were willfully blind to anything that didn't directly threaten their authority. They found moments together, early mornings when Sarah would happen to be drawing water at the same time Nahale was checking on the horses, evenings when he would visit her cabin to discuss some practical matter, and stay to share a meal. They had to be careful, but they had time now and patience. "Do you regret it?" Nahale asked one evening as they sat outside Sarah's cabin watching the sunset. It was 6 months since their arrival at the reservation, and Sarah had just received a letter from her sister in Philadelphia begging her to come home. "Regret what?" "This." Nahale gestured around them. "Leaving your old life. Living like this." Sarah considered the question seriously. The reservation was harsh, the living conditions were difficult, and she missed many things about her former life. "But I regret that your people had to give up their freedom," she said finally. "I regret that there wasn't another way. But coming here, being with you? No, I don't regret that. Even though we cannot marry, even though what we have must stay hidden." The question of marriage had been an ongoing source of pain for both of them. Mixed marriages were illegal in the territory, and even if they hadn't been, the social consequences would have been devastating. They could live together, love each other, build a life together, but it would never be officially recognized. "Nahale," Sarah said, turning to face him, "do you remember what you told me about the desert teaching in whispers?" He nodded. "Well, I've learned something from the desert too. I've learned that the most important things can't be taken away by laws or governments or other people's opinions. What we have, what we've built together, that's real whether anyone else recognizes it or not." Nahale reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You sound like a Apache woman now." "Good," Sarah said firmly. "Because that's what I am." Their life together developed a rhythm over the following months. Sarah threw herself into helping the Apache families adapt to reservation life, using her education to help children learn English while also encouraging them to maintain their Apache language and customs. She wrote letters for those who needed to communicate with government officials and gradually became an informal liaison between the Apache community and the reservation administration. Nahale, meanwhile, struggled with his role as a leader without the power to truly lead. The Army had made it clear that traditional Apache governance was no longer acceptable. All decisions had to be approved by Agent Crawford, and Apache customs that didn't align with white expectations were forbidden. It was during one of these conflicts that Sarah truly understood the depth of what Nahale's people had lost. A young Apache woman named Maria had died in childbirth, leaving behind a newborn son and a husband devastated by grief. According to Apache tradition, the community would hold ceremonies to help the woman's spirit find peace and to ensure the baby would be properly cared for by the extended family. Agent Crawford forbade the ceremonies. "These pagan rituals are contrary to Christian teaching," he declared when Nahale requested permission for the traditional observances. "The child will be raised in the mission school, where he can receive proper Christian education." Sarah watched Nahale struggle to contain his anger, taking the baby away from his family, preventing the community from properly mourning Maria, it was cultural destruction disguised as benevolence. Mr. Crawford, Sarah said carefully, perhaps you would allow me to speak with you privately about this matter? In Crawford's office, Sarah chose her words very carefully. Mr. Crawford, I understand your concerns about Christian education, but taking a newborn from his family might seem harsh to your superiors in Washington. The child needs proper care, which his family can provide. But if you're concerned about his Christian education, perhaps we could arrange for me to provide it. I could ensure he learns English and Christian principles while remaining with his Apache family. Crawford was clearly torn. He wanted to enforce his authority, but he also didn't want to look like a man who separated infants from their families. Finally, he agreed to allow the baby to remain with his Apache relatives, provided Sarah supervised his proper education. It was a small victory, but an important one. The ceremonies for Maria were held quietly, with Sarah standing guard to ensure no government officials interfered. Baby Joseph would grow up knowing both worlds, Apache and white, and Sarah would make sure he was proud of both sides of his heritage. Incidents like this happened regularly, and gradually Sarah found herself becoming something she never expected, a bridge between two worlds. Her presence on the reservation, her relationship with Nahale, her growing fluency in Apache customs and language made her uniquely qualified to help navigate the complex tensions between the Apache community and their white administrators. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it was a life with purpose. And it was a life with love. 2 years after arriving at the reservation, Sarah stood in the same spot where she and Nahale had watched the sunset on that first evening, but everything had changed. The government had finally permitted some improvements to living conditions. There was a school where Apache children could learn both English and their traditional language. There was a clinic where both Apache healing practices and white medicine were used. There was a slowly growing sense that maybe, just maybe, the two cultures could coexist rather than one destroying the other. Nahale approached from the direction of the horse corral, and Sarah's heart still skipped when she saw him. Time had weathered them both. Sarah's hands were rougher now, her skin darker from the desert sun, her clothes simpler and more practical. Nahale showed the strain of leadership in harsh circumstances, but there was also a peace in him that hadn't been there.